Hello, my name is Lindsay Dinsmore. I'm from the Teach Now cohort of January 2015, number 3. For this lesson, I will be reflecting on the lesson planning strategies and effectiveness of two of my co-teachers at the American International School of Chennai. I've had the honor of working with Mr. Bill Hoffman, my mentor, whom I taught 7th grade life science with this past year. And next year, I will be teaching 6th grade math and science with Miss Rebecca Lopata. So both teachers have been excellent in lesson planning, including me in the lesson planning process. So I've had quite a bit of experience this year working with both and also seeing the effectiveness of their lesson plans in the classroom. Bill plans using a Google Doc and template with which he shares the sharing rights to each of us co-teachers. And Rebecca does the same thing, but she uses a Google Slides presentation. So the idea of that is that she's planning each of her activities throughout the lesson that will then guide her through the lesson as she's teaching it. So I'm going to walk you through their lesson plans in a moment so you can see for yourself how they plan and the effectiveness of their planning. Okay, so next I'm going to walk you through one of Rebecca Lopata's lesson plans. You can see here that the title of this lesson is What is a Ratio? So she'll be introducing that concept to the students for this lesson. Now, Rebecca typically plans her lessons using a 20-60-20 ratio. So the first 20% of the lesson is the input, and this is the part of the lesson that the students are, or the teacher is describing what the students will be learning for the day. So that may be the direct instruction. The 60% of the lesson is the intake, where students are practicing or making meaning of the content. And the third part is also 20%, and that's the output. And that's where the students are showing their attainment of the content. So, to begin with, at the beginning of the day, or the beginning of the lesson, Rebecca starts with a problem of the day, or POD. So for this problem of the day, the students are using graph paper. They're given a small picture of a house, and they're supposed to make the exact same house on a piece of paper, but 3 times as large. So on their graph paper, they'll draw the small house and then the house 3 times as large. And they have to figure out a strategy for making that house 3 times as large. So in this problem of the day, they're using ratios, even though they may not understand what the concept of a ratio is quite yet. So once they have completed that task, they will move on to the second portion, and I'm sorry, but my computer has a slight delay. So the second portion is to show their math. So first they've started with the modeling part of the math problem, and the second aspect is showing their thinking with numbers. So how can they show what they did on paper in Afterwards, they'll go over the math schedule for the day. So they completed the problem of the day, and then you can see she's posted up here the essential questions for the lesson of the day. So first, what is? Second is how do we find different kinds of ratios? And then from then on, you go into simplifying and finding equivalent ratios. And then finally, you can use the ratios to find similar fractions and decimals, and comparing ratios, fractions, and decimals to each other. How are they different? How are they the same? So you can see within the schedule here itself that Rebecca does a really great job of scaffolding her lessons, starting out with the basics, what is a ratio, to then building on, okay, what are some different kinds of ratios? How can we simplify them, find equivalents? How are they related to other concepts? So Rebecca, I'd have to applaud her in her strategy here on providing really well scaffolded lessons. So now we get into the 20% of the lesson, the input. This is where Rebecca does direct instruction of what is a ratio. So here she's provided 2 examples of ratios, and then working with a table partner, students must define what is a ratio. Once they've discussed with their table partner, they then move on into their blue vocabulary books. And within these blue vocabulary books, they have an advanced organizer that's broken into quadrants. So in the middle is the vocabulary word, and then they have a space for a translation, they have a space for a drawing, they have a space for a definition, as well as space for an example of how would they use that word in a sentence. So this is a really good strategy and effective differentiation for our low-level learners as well as for our English language learners. And this makes sure that all of the students are entering into the lesson at the same level. Next, we get into the portion where the kids are actually doing the intake, the 60%. So they're practicing with ratios and making meaning of how to use ratios. So this activity, students are comparing two amounts of things. So they're making examples of their own. So for example, a ratio of boys to girls or teachers to students. And so here is a perfect example that the teacher is providing for the students to follow along with. And then they're going to practice on their own on this page here. If the students just click on the page, it will directly link them to that document where they practice doing ratios of a part to a part to a whole, and a whole to a part. Okay, so they gradually work their way from the first step to the third step at their own pace. Then they take the next step into trying to simplify ratios. So he or she provides a hint. Can you divide both the numbers by a common factor? And if it can't be simplified, why not? So again, Rebecca is very well scaffolding this lesson so that they work from the very basics up until they can increase their learning of the content. So here they are learning to simplify, and then moving forward, they have to find an equivalent fraction or even an equivalent decimal. So again, they click on this document and they can match equivalent ratios. So that is the 60% of the lesson. Again, that is the intake portion where they are practicing their learning. And finally, in the last 20%, students show their outputs. So this is where they show their attainment of the content, and this is where Rebecca is doing her formative assessment. So they're given a Venn diagram, and within that Venn diagram, they are asked to compare fractions and ratios. How are they similar, and how are they different? And think about how they are used, what they mean, how are they written, okay? So again, this is the final formative assessment for the lesson that Rebecca collects as the exit ticket at the end of the lesson to see who is getting the big idea of this lesson. We're going to start off with Bill's lesson plan. You can see the title up here is that this is the first unit. This is the Characteristics of Living Things unit, okay? And this is the planning document that is shared amongst all of us co-teachers. So Bill tends to use this same template for all of his lessons. So at the start, we see the standards, and this is a little vague. This is because we are switching from what used to be Arrow standards to now the NGSS standards. And of course, it lists the resources that we will need. So moving forward, this is lesson number 8. And it has the date that this was taught on. Starting with the language objectives that are expected, this is incredibly important because we have lots of English language learners, and I apologize because I have a plane traveling overhead. But we have lots of English language learners, so these language objectives are really important for us to write down and keep in mind at the beginning of the lesson. Followed by then the vocabulary, and this won't be all of the vocabulary covered within one lesson, but the vocabulary that's been covered from the beginning of the unit up to the current lesson. So not all of these will be covered within this lesson, but have been covered previously. Then we scroll down and we see the content objective for the day. All right, and this is to create a food chain and demonstrate understanding of how energy moves through the living parts of the ecosystem. So that is the objective, and that will be the activity that the students will be performing for the lesson. Each lesson starts out with a warm-up. I would click it, but my computer is so slow that it would take forever to boot up. So instead we do have the questions here that are shown in the warm-up. But the whole idea of the warm-up is to provide the students a time to think about and get into the content. So it generally tends to involve the big idea of the lesson and introduce whatever the topic is that's going to be discussed for that lesson. So in this circumstance, it would be how are producers different from consumers? So comparing and contrasting producers and consumers. And then what does the food chain show? And in these parentheses, this wouldn't be included on the slideshow itself, but it says, does all of the energy in an organism get transferred? So that's the main idea that we're looking for here. So this link here brings us to a slideshow, which the students see on the smartboard. And then each student has their own journal, a warm-up journal in which they write their answers. So they can just copy and paste the questions from the PowerPoint, and then just paste it into their own journal and answer the questions. So this is done in a think, pair, share strategy. Every day they have this warm-up where they think and they answer the questions on their own. Then they pair up with a partner and compare and contrast their answers. And then we'll share as a whole class. And that usually leads into a discussion where we get into the key points and essential questions for the day. So the second part of this lesson would be sharing the food chain document rubric. So again, as I mentioned, the content objective for this day is to create a food chain, which they are actually doing as an activity. So to introduce that activity, we are sharing with them the rubric and showing them the expectations and explaining what it is that they're going to be doing. This also involves showing them an example. So they will be using an online tool called Glyphy. So if you go to glyphy.com, and it's kind of like a mind mapping tool. And so using that mind map tool, they can insert pictures, they can draw arrows, and they can write little comment boxes. And using that tool, they're going to be making their own food chains. This is how a typical lesson with Bill is, starting with the warm-up and then leading into an activity or project that the students are directing their own learning. In conclusion, I hope that all I have learned from Bill and Rebecca and Teach Now and various other teaching influences in my life, I hope to create the optimal learning experience for my students next year. Already I have in mind the lesson planning strategies that I intend to adopt and those that I intend to avoid as well, in order to create my own system that works best for me. For example, I like how Rebecca plans with her PowerPoint, and that guides her through the lesson. I also like how her lessons are very skillfully scaffolded so that they build on concepts step by step for students to follow along with throughout the lesson. However, I also like how Bill uses project-based learning to grasp students' interest in content, and as well as making it accessible for everybody. Bill's effective integration of technology in the classroom is something I definitely aspire for.